All right there, everyone. It is time for us to talk a bit about Hurricane Florence and why it represents the potential for actually two disasters in its wake. But before we do, if you haven't already done so, make sure to hit that bell and subscribe button. It'll be a pleasure and a privilege to have you as part of this channel. Now, of course, when it comes to this hurricane, the main thing here involves the potential for natural disasters in the wake of the storm's path. But there's another disaster to be on the lookout for, and that is not the natural, but rather the cultural catastrophe that is the corporatist globalist media's account of this storm. I think in many respects that this cultural catastrophe, as I'm calling it, can be as significant to the political functioning of our society as the natural catastrophe represented by the storm. And I want to develop that a little bit for you. But first, just some heads up on the status of the storm, Hurricane Florence. As many of you know, it has been confirmed that the hurricane is very strong, very significant. It's officially a Category 4 storm. It has winds projected around 130 miles per hour. They may surge up to 140 miles per hour. It's expected to hit landfall here in the States, somewhere between South Carolina and Virginia by Thursday evening, and there have been mandatory evacuations ordered in the Carolinas, I believe also in Virginia Beach. Some areas, though we're not quite sure where, but some areas can expect to get hit with anywhere from 20 to 30 inches of rain. So there's just no question this is going to be a big storm. Now, with all of this, there's something else we ought to be looking out for. We need to be very much aware of the kinds of disaster narratives that are spun by the media. And this is something that even academia has expressed concern over. And let me give you an example of what I am talking about here, particularly with academia. A few of us would defend the Bush administration's handling of Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. I certainly wouldn't defend it. But among those who recognize the media's role in that miserable disaster management was the scholar Kathleen Tierney. She's actually known as a disaster researcher. How would you like that as your job title? I'm head of disaster research. This disaster researcher, Kathleen Tierney, published a paper shortly after the Katrina tragedy, and that paper was severely critical of the corporatist media and the consequences of what she saw as an absolutely irresponsible narrative superimposed on the events surrounding the Katrina natural catastrophe that actually exasperated that catastrophe. What she noted was that when you looked at the media coverage, you'd notice that media outlets such as the venerable New York Times, they wrote quite literally these post-apocalyptic depictions of a world gone mad in New Orleans. She points to a September 3rd article in the Times that described conditions on the ground just after the flooding as comprised of nothing but mass anarchy, death, looting, rapes, marauding thugs, an inept and gutted police force. Now, of course, when the waters began to recede a week later, she notes that we found that all these images depicting a collapsing civilization were, for all intents and purposes, fictitious. There was no evidence of any mass rapes. There were no piles and piles and piles of dead bodies. The police force was thoroughly intact and the like. But what Tierney points out, and what's so interesting here, in that in the meantime, before the floodwaters receded, government officials actually believed these media accounts and began to treat New Orleans as a military operation, precisely because the very metaphors that the media drew from in reporting the conditions on the ground were metaphors drawn from war coverage. And so it's been pointed out, Katrina was not a war, but it was depicted by the media as one, replete with lawless insurgents. And so Tierney notes that these distorting images and metaphors reported by the media were a primary reason why the 63,000 National Guard troops were deployed explicitly not to rescue disaster victims, but to arrest looters and incarcerate any and all urban insurgents. So because of this faulty coverage, the deployment really did turn New Orleans into a war zone and significantly hampered rescue and recovery efforts. And this war zone scenario only exacerbated the faulty coverage. You had reporters comparing New Orleans with Kabul or Baghdad or Mogadishu. And then that enabled them, the corporatist media, to extend Bush's failed Iraq policy campaign to a failed New Orleans campaign, right? The narrative served to widen the source of Bush's unpopularity, which was the overseas war in Iraq that had been turning for the worse, and bring that source of unpopularity here on our shores within our own nation, which served to weaken further what the media saw as an already very, very weak president. So as it turns out, so much of the coverage of Katrina was deliberately intended to weaken the Republican Party politically. In fact, I know of Democrats who thought that Katrina sealed the fate of congressional Republicans when they were trounced in the midterms by the Democrats in 2006. But what's important in all of this to remember, as scholars have pointed out, that the secular corporatist media did not depict what was really happening, the real disaster, as it were, with Hurricane Katrina. Instead, they simply replayed a disaster narrative that was already found in their imaginations and the imaginations of the general public that we all learned from like Hollywood movies and other kinds of disaster fiction. What we have to remember is that disasters and catastrophes are, in many respects, media-born. And this is because the cultural interpretation of the natural catastrophe is filtered through the lens of metaphors, images, and narratives, whereby the media tries to make sense of what happened. And when that media is a corporatist, globalist media, it's inevitably going to interpret that disaster in highly secular, corporatist, globalist terms. Now, of course, we saw this with the media's coverage of President Trump during the Hurricane Harvey scenario, which cost over $100 billion worth of damage. They tried in many respects to do to Trump what they did to Bush. They wanted to show that Trump was incompetent, incoherent in response to the Houston tragedy. They failed, of course, but they still tried. There's a headline here from Vanity Fair. Oh boy, you know you're going to get a sense of reality from Vanity Fair, don't you? That's where I want to go to understand the world. But nevertheless, here you go. Here's the headline. As Harvey drowns Houston, Trump struggles to contain himself. And then the lead is, the president's morbid excitement was on full display as the hurricane hit America's fourth largest city. Now, this writer isn't reporting what happened with Trump in Houston. This is not a mere transmission of untainted objective reality. This is what we call a constructed reality, okay? As much as this reporter wanted to present what she was communicating as what was really happening in the world, all she was doing was constructing her own account of her own liberal experience of what happened. And that experience, of course, is comprised of narratives, metaphors, and images that are hardly neutral, hardly objective, but are rather loaded with biases and preconceptions that become an inescapable part of the reality that she's mediating for us. This is not objective news in any way, shape, or form. Or take another headline from Mother Jones. Trump can say whatever he likes. He's made rebuilding a safe Houston much, much harder. And then they go on to fault him for ending an Obama-era regulation that forced future building to comply with tougher flood standards. Or take the venerable Stephen Colbert of late night, right? He needed to get his 2 cents in. So he ripped President Trump for not meeting with a single victim of the storm during his visits to Texas. Now, of course, that turned out to be a lie. That wasn't true. A number of media outlets have corrected Colbert on this. But, you know, let's face it, what's truth to Stephen Colbert? And then, not to be outdone, guess what headlined the Yahoo news feed? You ready for this? Houston teen whose home was flooded now faces second threat if Trump passes DACA. DACA's a pro-immigration program here in the States. There you go. I mean, this isn't reporting. This is propaganda. This is the manufacturing of disaster from a pro-DACA globalist perspective. Nothing more. Not one whit more. Now, I'm earnestly praying that we see but minimal damage with Hurricane Florence, and we on the East Coast certainly all need to keep our eye on the storm and prepare accordingly. But as much damage as this natural disaster can inflict, let's keep in mind that it's also made all the more heinous by the cultural disaster brought upon this nation by the corporatist globalist media. The catastrophes that we face are not merely natural, they are also cultural. The narratives, the metaphors, the images and descriptions surrounding the storm and the political impacts of such are inevitably reflective of a secular globalist perspective that becomes an intrinsic part of the reality reported on. And these perspectives can often have detrimental consequences like they did in New Orleans, and attempted political consequences as with the presidencies of Bush and Trump. With that in mind, let's all be discerning towards both the natural as well as cultural threats that are in our midst. As always, please like, comment, and subscribe. Click on our Patreon and PayPal links below. Become a monthly or one-time supporter of this channel and help us to continue to analyze current events in light of conservative trends so that you can personally and professionally flourish.